Great. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation to the talk. I remember last time, I remember during the quarantine sort of time, I remember visiting one of Jairus's classes and talking to maybe some of you all about DNG. It was really excellent. So I was really honored and excited to come back and in the context of this political science colloquium, give some of my thoughts on Kafka's Animal Machines and this question of Kafka, Deleuze and Guattari, and two terms that I'm going to be rotating around that I know are important to you and are certainly important to me, anthropocentrism and fascism. And so I don't know if there are any MS Paint fans in the crowd, but that's what we're starting with. Okay. I'm a big lover of MS Paint, and I'm going to clarify just sort of my thoughts of what are the stakes of this talk about Kafka and DNG in this context. So the way that I've been describing this to myself and in my work is as a sort of conceptual chiasmus. So a crossing an X. So at the center here, we have, of course, we have Kafka, and then we have anthropocentrism, fascism, Deleuze and Guattari, and animal studies. So I'll I'll get into exactly what the relations between these terms are in this context, but it's very complex, very crossed, very interlaced. But basically, the basic interest is animal studies, which I consider my work to be a part of and to be very important, has read Kafka and Deleuze and Guattari as anti-anthropocentric authors. So I'm going to be talking a lot about this concept, becoming animal, that Deleuze and Guattari get from a reading of Kafka. This concept has largely been received by readers of Deleuze and Guattari as a concept aimed at anthropocentrism, that if you want to think about becoming animal, if you want to theorize becoming animal, you're doing it because you want to challenge anthropocentrism, whether politically, conceptually, literarily, however it may be, right? So the interest of this concept is for readers of Deleuze and Guattari to challenge anthropocentrism. So what I'm going to show you and talk to you about and try to convince you is kind of an interesting situation, is that Deleuze and Guattari, at least in Kafka, where they introduced this concept, don't really care about anthropocentrism at all. And I don't really say that as a criticism necessarily, but it's just that that's not their interest in this book or with this concept. They write Kafka towards minor literature in order to think Kafka as a anti-fascist and humanist writer. So for Deleuze and Guattari, Kafka is a humanist writer, and this is a good thing. And we'll talk about exactly why that is. So just the first blush of what's going on here, what's happening for me was, hey, it's kind of interesting, kind of strange how different the reception of becoming animal was versus sort of how it was originally. And again, I'm not saying, hey, that's cheating. You guys should have read it correctly. I'm just saying, hey, that's interesting. It's interesting. Why has this concept been taken up by animal studies so enthusiastically? And I'll get into some quotations, but I have been able to find not a single text, not a single article, not a single book that takes seriously becoming animal as an anti-fascist humanist tool. Okay, this is just completely not mentioned in the reception, and it's an overwhelming concern in the original book. Okay, the original book when the concept was introduced. So that's my initial interest in, like, hey, let's read some Kafka and see what's going on here. Okay, so I have a PowerPoint to show you some quotes and to sort of organize this thinking. So if becoming animal is not supposed to deal for Deleuze and Guattari with anthropocentrism, what is it supposed to deal? It's supposed to deal with fascism. What is that? What do I mean by that exactly? Well, the basic idea is Becoming Animal was something that arose in Kafka with his short stories that he sort of later realized was some kind of mistake, that was not appropriate to confront fascism for Deleuze and Guattari. Becoming Animal in Deleuze and Guattari's reading ends up just having no justification and no basis in Kafka's literary machine. So here I just have some quotes about the arguments I just made, but these are two examples of how Becoming Animal has been received, right? So Irving Goh says, to accept Becoming Animal, one must be prepared to push existing political thought beyond its anthropocentric or anthropomorphic limits. Okay, Becoming Animal, anti-anthropocentrism thing. Okay, Bednarik says something that I think is telling when she says, assuming our goal is to change the anthropocentric angle of thought, could the concept of becoming serve this goal? So again, in the reading of Deleuze and Guattari, there is a widespread, I think, in my view, universal assumption that becoming animal exists to challenge anthropocentrism. Okay, so I feel like that's the starting point, right? So what's so weird about this is that Deleuze and Guattari think that because the 20th century, the term they use is diabolic forces. So they use maybe one of my favorite lists I've ever read, which is Stalinism, fascism, Americanism. Those are the three diabolic forces in 20th century. It's a repeated list they give, corresponding roughly to Kafka's three novels, right? America being Americanism, The Trial being Stalinism, The Castle being fascism. But these diabolic forces were for Deleuze and Guattari, they didn't really have anything to do with animals. They're about man being displaced, man being deterritorialized, man being industrialized, bureaucratized, etc. And so insofar as Kafka is an author who wishes to challenge in some fashion those diabolic forces for them, his animal sort of obsession, his animal kick with the short stories was just a distraction. So they say this several times in several different ways, and you'll end up getting bored, I think, of all the quotes I have about it at some point. But one of the most illustrative moments is here. Through the use of human parts and cogs, Kafka can realize effects of inhuman violence and desire that are infinitely stronger than those one can obtain with animals or isolated mechanisms. So when Kafka transitions from short stories to novels, for Deleuze and Guattari, the reason the novels are better is they get rid of that animal stuff. They're not talking about animals anymore. They're focusing on what really matters, this fascist, what they call the mechanic assemblage, right? And the second key aspect of this, is that it's accelerationist. So the Kafka of Deleuze and Guattari is accelerationist. So what do I mean by that? I mean, for Deleuze and Guattari, fascist desire is so tied up and so indistinguishable from, say, non-fascist or democratic desire that critique, insofar as critique has to distinguish between those two things, is useless. We can't look at a social field or a political formation and know who's fascist and who's not for Deleuze and Guattari. It's just not as straightforward as that in a certain way. You can try in a sort of local way, but as an aggregate macro strategy, critique is not going to work. So if we can't sort through the totality and pick out what's fascist and what's not, how do we confront fascism? Well, for Deleuze and Guattari, you have to speed everything up. There's a sense in which fascism needs to stop its movement. As obsessed as fascism is with speed, it needs to stop its movement at something. It needs to solidify at some point, whether that's the Aryan race, whether that's a bureaucratic structure, whether that's an identity of the, say, the freed socialist worker as the end of politics. These sorts of diabolic formations just can't let speed go as far as it can go and still survive, as much as they love speed. So the animal, part of the reason the animal is a distraction is not only is it not related to fascism for Deleuze and Guattari directly, because fascism is about man and displacing man, but also animals are just too slow. They say over and over, becoming animals too slow. It's too slow. It's totally dogmatic claim. They never explain why, what makes become it, but they repeatedly refer to it as if it's a fact. Oh, becoming animal just isn't as fast as what they call the mechanic assemblage. So the object of the novel. So this is the progressive and I argue dialectic progression of Kafka for Deleuze and Guattari. So you got the letters. We don't need to talk so much about them, but Kafka, if you know anything about him, he didn't eat so much. And their argument about Kafka is the letters were sort of his food. He kept needing to get letters to get some energy to write. Okay, they were necessary, but they never actually create anything. What's better than the novels is the short stories. They have becoming animal. Okay, they have. So if you're not familiar with Kafka, his short stories are often narrated from the perspective of an animal. They often involve people turning into animals. They stage very often the border between animals and humanity being porous or reversible, this being a reversible relation. So Luz and Guattari are quite correct that this is a focus of the short stories in a way that it seems not to be in the novels. It's and what I try to do in the article that this talk is based on is just really give Deleuze and Guattari sort of their due in this context. They are correct. Animality is not as prominent in Kafka's novels. The question is, what does that mean? What do we do with that? For Deleuze and Guattari, for whom the novels are the perfect Kafka, the best Kafka, the Kafkiest Kafka that ever Kafka'd. Okay. The short stories are him not yet at his perfection, not yet at his anti-fascist, humanist, accelerationist sort of greatest hits level. Okay. And so in my sort of deconstructive way, I want to acknowledge the fact that in the novels, animals are not getting the same airtime. Something has changed. But I don't want to accept the narrative of Kafka had to get rid of animals because they're too slow and too irrelevant, and just they're just a big distraction. And the simplest reason why we have to challenge that is we need to be able to understand, why did Kafka write all these animal stories in the first place if it was just a total risk failure for his project, right? I think Deleuze and Guattari in this book are very classically Hegelian and dialectic, as strange as that may sound, that the letters have to be sublated, dialectically surpassed by the short stories. The short stories have to be sublated and dialectically surpassed by the novels. And it's not a coincidence that they end up with a very anthropocentric reading strategy with a dialectic mode of reading. I mean, we can talk some about that, but maybe people have questions related to Hegel and my thoughts about this. But very strange bedfellows here if you look past the surface, right? Okay, so in this context, right? So what is my thinking? What's the upshot of this weird situation where becoming animal has been sort of taken up by animal studies very enthusiastically as an anti-anthropocentric tool, right? And yet it is actually a barrier to Kafka's project for Deleuze and Guattari. So I'll just read, this is how I try to make sense of it. Okay, and so my argument is that in the shadow or light of becoming animal, in the thinking of this concept, right, and this textual situation, animal studies confronts what I would call constitutive fascist risk. And so what I mean by that is that animal studies and Deleuze and Guattari share a certain way of thinking of the opposition between nature and technology, or nature and techne, that keeps nature simple, that keeps nature undifferentiated, that keeps nature without politics or sociality of its own. And that is why it appears so simple and something that so obviously must be gotten rid of. And my ultimate wider argument is that this is a Heideggerian problematic, that this is a Heideggerian thinking of technology that we all share in some fashion, and that it's our obligation to interrogate. So I'm going to go through a little bit of Deleuze and Guattari's reading, just like what their critique, and it really is if I were to use sort of modern internet language, I would say they flame becoming animal. They are incredibly negative about becoming animal in Kafka. They say over and over it's condemned to failure. Condemned to failure is the most common phrase. And these two quotes should help explain a little bit of how they characterize it. So if people know the most classic sort of paradigmatic Kafka short story, The Metamorphosis, right? Guy literally turns into a bug, a roach, and then dies. Okay, so it's a sort of literal becoming animal situation. Deleuze and Guattari cite this as becoming animal sort of never had a chance. It has some creativity, it has some movement, but what the metamorphosis teaches us is it ends up dying. So I'll read these two quotes for you. I think they're helpful and sort of summarize this, right? So Gregor's metamorphosis was the story of a re-Oedipalization that leads him into death, that turns his becoming animal into a becoming dead. Not only the dog, but all the animals oscillate between a schizoeros and an Oedipal thanatos. So I just want to underline that there is no account of becoming animal in the literature that even mentions this argument that I know of. That it's not even a matter of like this hasn't been taken seriously. It's a matter of everybody who writes about becoming animal does it in a manner that is, if not affirmative, at least doesn't acknowledge how negative it was for Deleuze and Guattari, even minimally. So even minimally. And here's another quote that I think helps elucidate this. And yet, so after discussing the failure of Gregor and the metamorphosis, it is not certain that Gregor was at fault. So it's not like, oh, in this case, Gregor just didn't do it right. He just didn't becoming animal right. Isn't it rather that the acts of becoming animal don't manage to follow their principle all the way through? That they keep a certain ambiguity that leads to their insufficiency and condemns them to defeat. So condemned to defeat, condemned to failure, condemned to defeat. This is over and over what they're going to say about becoming animal in the Kafka book. So the fact is that Kafka's principal animal stories were written just before the trial or at the same time, like a sort of counterpoint to the novel, which for its part frees itself from any animal problem in favor of a higher problem. So this is their argument. They're very upfront about this. They're very clear about animals are a just silly distraction for Kafka. And the trial and the castle in particular purified themselves of animality so that they could be perfect, that they could be their word, and they use the word invincible. So immortal in a certain fashion. Okay, so how is this as a reading of Kafka? Now, I'm going to spend some time now going into a certain scene from Kafka's. My Zoom is sort of crashing. I forgot Zoom. I remember these moments. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. So I actually can't see myself, but that's really not a big deal.
We can see you.
But okay, great. So hope to just have convinced you, or at least let you to think initially that there's something strange going on with Deleuze and Guattari's reading of Kafka, and that it has to do. It's centered on the question of animality, and it's centered on the question of the relation of animality and nature to something like a machine, something like mechanics, right? And the opposition for Deleuze and Guattari is becoming animal and animality have to be replaced by mechanicity, that there's something inherently human about mechanicity, or that animals cannot participate in. Okay, right? So that's the reading. So to challenge this reading, what I tried to do is focus on a specific example of the relation between animals and machines that actually Deleuze and Guattari highlight. And that's the example of the horse. So they say that the horses in Kafka are a sort of intermediary situation in that they are still an animal, but also in some certain way already a machine, most exemplarily in the context of a sleigh, right? In the simple way that a sleigh is a machine hooked up to an animal, et cetera. So in Kafka, what I'm going to spend some time talking to you about now is sleighs in the castle. So the castle is for Deleuze and Guattari the most perfect Kafka novel, even more so than the trial, for certain reasons can't go into. That would take a while to explain, but if people are interested, I'm happy to explain why they hierarchize the three novels and the castle wins. But I'm going to focus on sleighs in one chapter of the castle. So this chapter is subtitled or is titled. It's important to remember all the titles come from Max Brod. None of the titles are Kafka's, but I think this is a fine title for the chapter. It's called "Waiting for Clam." Waiting for Clam. Now, Clam is the uber villain of the castle. People don't know that Clam is the guy that the whole time Kay, the protagonist, is trying to find so that it can be explained to Kay why he got invited to be a land surveyor at the castle when all the land had already been surveyed. So he gets there and immediately they're like, no, we know where everything is, man. We don't need a land survey. So he's like, I'm gonna figure out why this happened. I'm gonna get to the bottom of this. Why did I get told to come? Why did I get hired when nobody needed to hire me, right? So he's going after Clam. So this chapter kind of stages the whole problem of the novel in a sort of in micro, and it's centered around a sleigh, and so a certain kind of animal machine. And what I want the concept animal machine to mark, among other things, is that all the crazy transformations of the 20th century, the indeed diabolic transformations like fascism, bureaucratization, all these things, were not separate from questions of animality, right? They hooked up to animals in a certain way. They didn't just forget them. They didn't just efface them. They didn't just eliminate them. And I think if we want to have a way of thinking the opposition between nature and technology in a more complex way and in a way that's more hospitable to animality and hospitable to the non-human, Kafka's got a lot of ammunition for us for that. So, and I do one of the only, it's one of those things that's just, it's hard to say a coincidence, but that Kafka is one of the only photos of Kafka, there are like 6 or 7, is him with a sleigh. I mean, who knows? Okay, who knows? But just, I think it's kind of cool. Okay, I think it's kind of cool. This is the Kafka rock opera that I would have loved to show you. But if you search Kafka rock opera and you'll see this, it's really a joy. But okay, so now I'm going to get into the castle and just sort of take you through just a few paragraphs or passages where this sleigh is discussed and sort of try to see if I can convince you it's at least half as exciting as I think it is. So before I sort of just read out some Kafka to you, just want to set the stage of what's going on here. So I'd already told you that in this chapter, it's all about this sleigh. It's called Waiting for Clam. So sleigh, because the world of this will be important. The world of the castle is a permanent winter world, right? Always cold, always winter in the castle. It's a must have been a bummer, right? But but the sleigh is going to be in a certain way alien, in a certain way different. We'll get a sense that the sleigh is not, in fact, controlled by the fascist apparatus of the castle. That actually is sort of a way out for Kafka, but also for Kay, and that it's for some reason he just didn't take it. So as things start out, so this first quote. So Kay has heard about this sleigh. He's heard that there's a sleigh, and he from one of his friends, Pepe, and he runs off to go get it, to go see it. He doesn't explain why, but he immediately goes to where it's supposed to be, right? He meets a coachman, so someone who takes care of the sleigh, and this is that person talking to him. Do you want some brandy? Yes, said Kay spontaneously. The offer was too tempting, for he was chilled. Then open the sleigh. It's too awkward for me to get down in these furs. So the coachman is covered in furs, right? It annoyed Kay to have to wait on the coachman like this, but since he had already become involved with the man, he did as he was asked, even at the risk he might be surprised by Clam in the sleigh. So, two things I want to highlight for you about this initial paragraph. First, this logic that Kay uses, but since he had already become involved with the man, he did as he was asked. If taken to its if just taken seriously, it would mean obeying any command in general, right? Because you're if someone is giving you a command, you're already involved with them in some fashion, right? So if you take this argument literally, this is obeying all commands. So this would be a sort of accelerationist path of just yes, go, no matter what, right? So that's being staged here at this moment, right? So then, second thing, even at the risk that he might be surprised by Clam in the sleigh. So the big movement, the whole movement of the novel for Kay is like, is Clam here? Is that guy Clam? Is Clam going to be here soon? Is he away? Is he here? There's an oscillation of just Clam is like absent, present, absent, present. We don't know. He has a ghostly status, right? And he goes in thinking, he thinks it's Clam's sleigh. His friend told him it's Clam's sleigh. Turns out it's actually a sleigh meant for him, as we'll see. Okay, so let's follow him into the sleigh. This is fun. Okay. Fun for me. Hope it's fun for you. He opened the wide door and could have just taken the bottle out of the pocket on the inside of the door. But now that the door was open, he felt so strongly drawn to the interior of the sleigh that he could not resist. He only wanted to sit inside for a moment. He scrambled in. And the word for scrambled here is German huschen, which is like, it's also, I would probably translate it as scurry. It's a very animal-y movement, okay? The warmth in the sleigh was extraordinary and remained so, although the door, which Kay did not dare to close, was wide open. So this is something like a nuclear power plant or cold fusion reactor or something. I don't know how you use it, but it's like a infinite heat energy source in the fascist freeze land. Okay, it's worth noting, right? So he was so deep in blankets, cushions, and furs, he could not tell he was sitting on a bench. He could turn and stretch any way he wished and always sank back into a soft warmth. So it's something like a borderless infinite womb, something heating womb. Spreading out his arms, his head resting on the cushions that were readily available, Kay looked out of the sleigh into the darkened building. Why was Clam so long coming down? So, because again, Kay thinks this is Clam's sleigh. He thinks that at any moment Clam's going to come and interrupt him. Okay. As if dazed by the warmth after standing so long in the snow, Kay wished that Clam would finally appear. So I make a big deal about this desire. So the reason I make a big deal about it is if Clam did finally appear, that would be the end of the novel, as insofar as the novel is defined by Clam's spectral status. And the whole movement of it is Clam has to be, in a certain sense, only present as a ghost. If Kay ever really met Clam, that's the end of the castle. That's the end of the whole fascist structure of the castle, right? So in this sleigh, Kay dreams of that in some fashion, right? I think not insignificant. Okay. So he's in there for a bit. And then he gets interrupted, okay? And he gets interrupted by a sort of described as a Herr in German, like always a hard word to translate, but just like a Mr. guy, a sort of Mr. man, okay? There is a guy that interrupts him and he is scared. He thinks, oh, this guy's gonna think I did something wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have stayed in the sleigh for too long, et cetera, right? And so there are a few more passages that about him being in the sleigh, and I think it gets to there are a few more interesting things I could draw out, but just for the purposes of this talk, all I want to highlight for you is the sleigh seems to be a moment that exceeds the fascism of the novel and that Kay draws back from it. And so then we're going to read through a little bit that drawing back and sort of characterize it, okay? So This is the sort of Hare or Mr. Man guy talking to him. And so my claim is that is this sleigh moment is like unique in all of Kafka. It's totally singular. There's no moment that seems like that it stages an exit from the fascism that Kafka is obsessed with and talks about throughout his work, right? But Kay reads it as a typically like Kafka-esque situation, and I think can clear this for you. And it directly leads to the sleigh, the animal machine, getting disassembled. So, come with me, says the man. I am waiting here for someone, Clam, said Kay, no longer in the hope of achieving anything, but simply to make a point. Come, said the man again, unperturbed, as if to indicate that he had never doubted that Kay was waiting for someone. So this guy knows what's going on. He knows the score, right? But then I shall miss the person I'm waiting for, Clam, said Kay with a convulsive gesture. That's such what said. I don't know what that would even be. That's great. But in spite of all that had happened, he had the feeling that what he had achieved so far was something gained. And even if he had only appeared to achieve it, he should not surrender it in response to some chance command. So a futile but principled gesture is how he sees his refusal here, right? Okay. And then this is a very key moment here from the guy. You'll miss him either way, whether you go or stay. This is just a factually true claim. Kay is never going to encounter Clam. Clam's ghostly status makes him impossible to ever be presented. The fact that Kay keeps thinking he can meet him is part of his involvement and entrapment in the structure of the castle, right? So this guy is telling the truth as far as we can tell. He's saying, let's go on the sleigh. You don't need to stay here, okay? Said the man, although he expressed himself brusquely, he seemed remarkably attuned to Kay's train of thought, right? He knows what's going on. Then I would rather wait and miss him, said Kay defiantly. He was certainly not going to be driven away from here simply by a few words from the young man. At this, the man ran the tip of his tongue around his half-open lips. It's so weird, dude. And said to the coachman, unharness the horses. So it's over. It's done. He tries to resist. This is a classic sort of Kay admirably tries to resist an authority figure, admirably in his mind, and it fails. Nothing happens, right? And then this is the very end of the chapter. It seemed to Kay as if all contact with him had been broken off, as if he were now indeed freer than ever. Yet at the same time, and this conviction was at least as strong, as if there was nothing more senseless, more desolate than this freedom, this waiting, this invulnerability. So at this moment, there's something like hope or something like escape from the castle. And in fact, and I think this is the only example in all of Kafka, in all of the Kafka novels at least, where an event like this gets brought up later in another chapter. And I'm going to show you where it gets brought up later. The castle tries to retcon this event away. It tries to repress or delete this event as if it never happened. Okay, it's a very complex and strange situation. So I'm going to pull up that moment now. So later on, Kay is talking to Olga. So about just how the castle works, what's going on in the castle, why it's not able to really respond to her father or her family's petitions. And Kay just keeps asking, like, how does it work? How does it work? And we learn a few things about the castle. We learn the way that work and messages are distributed on the castle are through these sleighs. And there are tons of these sleighs. And what Olga tries to convince Kay of, and does so successfully, is that this sleigh belonged to an official. This sleigh was part of the castle. So Olga says, when the officials drive to the village or back to the castle, they're not going on a pleasure excursion. There's work waiting for them both in the village and the castle. That's why they drive so fast. Nor does it occur to them to look outside of the carriage window in search of petitioners standing outside, because anyway, their carriages are crammed full of files, which they study as they're driven along. Okay, so Kay is going to bring back up this event with the sleigh, but he's going to edit it. He's not going to mention any of the cool or liberatory parts about it. The only thing he's going to mention is that there were no files in the sleigh. So Kay, when he's challenging this, when he's responding to this fascist structure of the castle, his strategy is fact-checking. His response to fascism is fact-checking. Let's find a data point not consistent with the fascist narrative and the way the fascist structure tells itself. And I think one of the many lessons I think Kafka can teach us, of which there are many examples, I think, in the contemporary political world, is that fascism doesn't mind getting fact-checked. It just really doesn't. That is not an effective way to confront it, but in fact feeds into it. So here's Kay trying to fact-check fascism, talking to Olga. So, but, said Kay, I've seen inside an official sleigh. This is this event we've been talking about. And there were no files in it. So I didn't have time to talk everything that I think is so cool about the sleigh, but I hope you can at least, even from what I have said, notice how strange it is to only cite that aspect of what happened in that context. That's not talking about the brandy, not talking about the dazed feeling, not talking about the coachman, the furs, that he was asked to go on sleigh, none of that. Only thing he remembers, and this is why I think it's an amnesic or retcon memory, is no files in it, right? So then this next part, Olga's story was revealing such a vast, almost unbelievable world, fascist world, to him, that he could not resist intruding on it with his own little adventure. So he's going to tell us why he did this, why he thought this was an appropriate way to respond. In order to convince himself of the existence of her world, as well as that of his own experience. So what this stages for me is a response to fascism by Kay of making it real, making it comprehensible, making it simple, making it slow, fact-checking it. And I think there couldn't be a less effective way politically to respond to fascism. And I think that's part of what this animal machine situation with Kay teaches us, that maybe part of fascism's effectiveness is that it baits you into responding to it with responding to its complexity with simplicity, responding to its hyper virtual illusions, paranoid fantasies with simple reality, and responding to its speed with slowness. And this, we'll see that Olga is perfectly able to integrate this when she responds. And I love her response. She's genuinely hilarious. That may be, said Olga. But then that's even worse, because it means that the official is dealing with such important matters that the files are too precious or bulky to be taken with him. And in that situation, officials have themselves driven at a gallop. At any rate, none of them has any time to spare for our father. So Kay's strategy to try to slow down fascism ends up speeding it up. And she gallops away functionally. She talks for maybe 10 or 15 more pages, longest speech in the novel, longest speech in any of Kafka's novels easily, and the sleigh is never mentioned again. It's successfully retconned out of the castle. Okay, so zoom out a bit. Okay, let's just to zoom out a bit. My main contention with this animal machine thing and this example of the sleigh is that if we follow it closely, it gives us a way to think about animality and technology in an anti-fascist way. It gives us resources to challenge anthropocentrism and fascism in a way we would not have otherwise. And the central motifs that I would hang on for that are, one, amnesia. So if animality is not just dumb, slow animals, if there's something about nature that is not just privation, would be one way to put it, not just deprived of a world, deprived of something, then it's because there is an affirmative political value to forgetting and to amnesia that Kafka thinks. Okay, so that'd be a first argument. The second argument would be which I already alluded to, which is the concept of animal machine would point to how fascist and capitalist and Stalinist industrializations, bureaucratizations, transformations had a relation to animality. They had a way to integrate animality. They had a way to plug it into them. It was not just irrelevant. It was not just a distraction, right? And Kafka puts us on the trail of that. And then something I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A, but that I don't want to, I don't want to make, I don't want to make a major point of the initial talk I just give you, is that I think the sort of key to this question and key to why we're thinking about nature techne in this way is Heidegger, and how we have sort of inherited, whether we know it or not, a certain way of thinking about technology in Heidegger, and that Deleuze and Guattari share this issue, and that's why they can't see how technology and animality hook up in a positive way in Kafka. They can only see dialectic progression, basically. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would say to start off. Please be happy to ask, be happy to answer any questions, etc. I'm really interested to hear what people might think. But yeah, thank you for listening to that initial just talk, but excited to discuss.
Says if you go online, you can also ask questions, and then I'll take questions from the audience. And if you can't hear them, I'll repeat. So, let's go first. Right, I may go first then. So I've been working for a while on this project the Navy developed in the 1960s to weaponize dolphins and whales. And I think that, like, similarly, the sort of initial response by people who are opposed to this for good reasons, it's sort of creepy to like install things in dolphins and whales and make them do things, is that it was like somehow like against their humanity. Like that there was a certain kind of like innocence to their animality, which was transposed into a humanity, and therefore it was wrong to make them do these things. The thing that is most disturbing to me, the more I do the research, is it seems clear that the animals really excel at killing people. Like the dolphins used in the Straits of Hormuz and the sea lions used in the Straits of Hormuz to attack Iranians when they try to approach US boats, like they're good at it. They're good at being soldiers. And so maybe it's sort of the flip side, but I guess my question is like, I see where you're trying to posit the becoming animal as potentially a way out of fascism, but doesn't undoing this nature technology bifurcation where they're opposed to one another also open the possibility that like there are capitalist dolphins and asshole sea lions, and maybe yes, like it all goes back to politics basically. Once we undo the nature techne distinction, we realize like maybe some of the orcas, are cool, and maybe some of the orcas are real jerks.
Yeah, so I would say, what I would say is like, I think I'm certainly not trying to say like becoming animal is good or bad or politically positive or not, really. I'm more just saying sort of Deleuze and Guattari gave it a really weird, they really undersold it and really hated it in ways that I don't quite understand. I wouldn't want to say, when we're talking about deconstructing the nature technology opposition, we're not replacing that with like, hey, everything's the same, everything's cool, everything's equal, etc. Right? But I would say that, that unless there is some way to include dolphins, sea lions, etc., in politics, the city, life, not maybe like that, not endorsing like that, but I'm saying unless there is some way to relate to them where they're part of the political and economic fields, we might as well just annihilate all of them, right? I mean, it's just like that's what's going to happen. So we can't just think that we can't try to preserve a sort of a nature purified of technicity, basically. So like there are going to be bad ways to integrate dolphins and sea lions, etc., and there are going to be good ways. I know that there's this one library in France where it's one of the Derrida libraries. They have goats that are employees of the library, and that eat the grass, and that's their job. They have little employee cards. Um, One very tiny example of a positive way to integrate, but I'm just saying there's good and bad ways, right? There's good and bad. I think that the Deleuze and Guattari position and the Heidegger position end up providing no space in the political or for animality. And that seems untenable ethically and politically to me.
Can I push that a little further though? Because Heidegger and Deleuze and Guattari are like the absolute favorite heroes of environmental studies and animals.
Yeah, I know.
Right? So like why do you think there's such a gravitational pull to these two thinkers who I agree, like, basically obliterate anything that's not a human?
So why? I think so. First of all, I will say I love reading Heidegger and Deleuze and Guattari, and I don't have any moral suspicion of anyone who does like reading them. I love reading them, feel totally innocent in that. But I think reading them in a celebratory, anti-anthropocentric way sort of does. Why are people who hate anthropocentrism so excited to read them? I think because there's a very persuasive description in Heidegger of how technology has sort of made everything appear like a battery. And it does seem like compelling that if everything appears like a battery, then we're just going to eat it and have factory farms and process it, et cetera, right? But the hope would be that you can have that critique of technology without denying that nature has its own technicity, has its own politics, has its own sociality. The problem is that's really hard to do unless you think really hard about this nature techne opposition, is the claim, right? And so the hope is that Kafka gives us a way to do that. But I mean, I think it's weird. Like, as I try to say, I think it's very weird that people cite the becoming animal thing and are like, hey, I'm all in on this to stop anthropocentrism, when the whole point of it is that it's anthropocentric for Deleuze and Guattari. Like, that's what's good about it. Heidegger's another case, but yeah, I'm still thinking, don't know exactly why it's happened. That ecological thinkers, and I consider myself one, are so excited about the wrong things in my view. Yeah.
Question about Kafka's essay, The Burrow. It always seemed to me that Kafka's critique of fascism is in that story, The Burrow, and especially through the concept of architecture. Have you worked with that story at all?
I have worked with that story. I think I'm not sure if I have a great bumper sticker for it. I would agree with the idea that there is a critique of fascism in it. Could you say a little more to just stage how I stage the question a little bit?
He's constructing sort of a false problem of security. And so at the very end, when he says he's an old architect, he said he's been inventing a world within which a certain kind of authority has dominance.
Yeah, so I think that you have in the Burrow a sort of, because for one thing, for what it's worth, people don't know, Deleuze and Guattari are very excited about the Burrow's architectural structure of that kind of every entry is also an exit. There's no beginning or end of the Burrow. It's sort of organized in a rhizomatic way, right? And I think what the Burrow stage is like an architect who constructs a kind of unmasterable network, but then does everything he can to master and securitize sort of this network. That would be the starting point I would have for looking at it. And just for, again, the narrator of the Burrow is an animal, or is almost certainly an animal. I don't think he ever says explicitly I am, but it seems like it's a mole or something writing it, just for people. Yeah. So I would try to think about like how could a rhizomatic structure be militarized or thought in a fascist security structure? That's kind of what the Burrow stages for me, because that's what happens in it. So I agree with you completely that whether that's all of the critique of fascism in Kafka is there or not, I don't know, but that's certainly an incredibly useful starting point.
And I think you continue hopefully. I just kind of want to circle back to the comment you made to Jairus' question about the good form of those goats with the jobs at the library and the presence that we have, especially in the digital realms, of the animal with the job and the animal as equation and in some kind of performance of the human task and the human performance. You know, we see the cat in the White House, the dog in the White House, and how they're presented as here are their responsibilities, here are the things they are serviced for. We see, and I have a very unfortunate preliminary reading of Kafka's work. In the Metamorphosis, the first thing upon becoming that monstrous vermin is, can I still work? And I have to go to work. Is the very nature of connecting these fields and bridging against the focus of the human by seeing the animal in labor, by seeing the animal as something that needs to be a productive unit, that is seeing it only by its service, still serving that same veneer. It seems as if all that we do to connect ourselves away from a pure animalism is to bring the animals into the technology, is to bring them into labor. And to that field, is that something narrow still?
So I think it's a great question and a real danger. So like the qualification I would be is that if I'm happy about goats working at this library, it's not because I think that animals need to be integrated only in terms of their value or only in terms of their productivity or only in terms of exchange. It's that rather that unless we try to think how we use animals and they use us and productivity happens in different economies, and we try to think about it in an ethical way, it's going to happen anyway, but just in a wildly unethical way. So it's just like, I think to say like, if we approach animality and say, okay, animals are sort of unthinkable, impossible to value, impossible to know, impossible to communicate with in any way, and thus impossible to integrate economically in any way, I think that's a non-starter sort of politically and ethically in terms of thinking about a community, that a multi-species sort of ethics. It doesn't mean I'm excited about, it doesn't mean like, oh, well, you know, we need to just start exploiting these animals better. That's how we integrate them. And we need to, no, but it's much more just like, if you approach it from an ecological perspective, often inspired by Heidegger, of like, just let the animal be, my claim is that it's sort of naive and ends up being hypocritical and in the worst case, fascist relation to life. That life is life itself is sort of purified of economy, is purified of technicity. Life is just, it doesn't have any of those things. So anytime we have an economic relation to animals, we're imposing it on them. I think that picture is kind of a trap. But you know, again, all I can say is just really like sort of sheepishly, I guess, no pun intended, that like, yeah, I agree with you that like the worst thing would be to just be an enthusiastic capitalist with animals. That would be a bad way to integrate them, and it sort of has been our way in a big way. Right? My hope would be that that would not be the alternative thing I'm advocating. But I agree. I see what you mean.
I think I'm imagining less about the idea of where animals exist with us and more of how we consume animals with us. It's less about the fact of integrating them, but like, how are the ways that people feel comfortable and enthused by integrating? Because the things that get the most clicks online is the funny image of the dog working a job. The thing that gets the most attention is the performance of an animal when it becomes the performance of it in these tasks that we associate with ourselves. If the human only understands itself as a laborer and can only associate integration of things into the equal lens and thus needs that as labor, even if it's positive, does not is the degeneration we treat for ourselves as being products needed of labor also equate to that? Does bringing animals in mean we also have to change the way we treat ourselves first?
Maybe not first, maybe simultaneously, or like I think I will say, just thinking about like what gets the most clicks, what the most thing, and I think you're totally right about like, and I will, admit, and I will confess that I see an animal in a funny hat and I do laugh, and I have a cat, and when I put a funny hat on her, I got to tell you that's funny, and I have thought about like what am I laughing at, like why do I think that's funny, and I think your concern, which I think is a really appropriate concern, if I can translate into my own words, is just like, is that laughter me enjoying the animal like failing to be human, or failing to be human in a goofy way, and in the worst cases failing to be a human in so where I consider a human to be a productive laborer or political entity or good hat wearer or whatever, and do I have in that laughter an implicit sort of tie to things I don't like and I don't want to have a tie to, right? I mean that's the sort of thing I've thought about. And my hope would be there's a way to laugh. And this is, I mean, essentially bring it out because like my next big project's all about laughter and talking about stuff like that. And I just like, how could we laugh like a Democrat? Like, how could we laugh like somebody who wants to challenge these things? And my hope, and I say this to my cat, is that I'm not laughing in that way, but I don't know. I'm unsure about that laughter. I can't swear it's not dangerous. Am I supposed to, do I answer the chat question, or what do I
Just a good talk. If it's a question, yeah, answer it.
Oh, okay. Do I read it out? Can people see it, or?
Oh, we can't see it because it disappeared for
Okay.
some. You can try.
I see. Okay. I'll read. How might this reading of Kafka's Becoming Animal potentially recast the Heideggerian, Weberian account of encroaching instrumentalism in bureaucracy or modernity? It seems to me instrumentalism is usually analogized to hive insects like ants or bees. Is becoming insect potentially more applicable, or is instrumentalism perhaps better reinterpreted for humans as tied to herd animals like horses? So I think it's a really great question. I think so. I responded with a few things. The first thing would be, I totally agree with you that the hive question and bees and ants in particular are super relevant. And in fact, when Deleuze and Guattari say Kafka, it's not just a coincidence that Kafka didn't write an animal novel. It's that it would have been a really crappy novel if he had written it. It would have just been humans replaced by bees or humans replaced by ants, is what he says, is what Deleuze and Guattari say. And they say, hey, there were other people at the time writing those novels. That's not Kafka's novel. Kafka's a human writer. As to whether instrumentalism is, I think instrumentalism has a few, greatest hits imaginaries. One of them being the hives thing. I think horses being a particular case too. There are a few. I think the hive is really important. But as to how this reading would sort of reorient an instrumentalism, I think the language of instrumentalism sort of already kind of gets us into thinking there's a pure, untouched nature prior to use or prior to our involvement with it. That the idea that I think the whole concept of use and language of instrumentality is itself kind of vocabulary that needs to be, and conceptual infrastructure that's got to be displaced, got to make some trouble for it. The idea there's no way to not have something like some sort of instrumental relation to things in the political, right? There's a pure non-use relation would not even be a relation that didn't even have the possibility of use, right? That would be the claim. So I would try to say, like, you think that if you're signing up for a Heidegger Weberian sort of instrumentalism critique of how we relate to animals, because you care about animals, I think you're sort of barking up the wrong tree, or at least you're barking up a tree that we've got to shake a bit or move around a bit or change in some fashion, right? Just conceptually, that instrumentality, I think, as a term and concept, that probably doesn't get us where we want to go politically, or at least where I want to go politically, for whatever that's worth.
Can I just throw out that I sort of don't agree that the internet is driven by animals doing human things. Like I think about how much the internet like grieved and actually got really like violently angry at Los Angeles when they killed this cougar who sort of refused to not treat the city as its home. Right? The cougar didn't like don like a Dodgers hat and go to Dodgers games. The cougar was just like, there are these things called dogs, they're just as good as rabbits. There are these things called cats, they taste just as good as, you know, whatever else I was chasing and eating. And I just like, it lived in the city. It was an urban lion, right? And I think similarly about the sort of Mediterranean orcas, right? Like, they're not cool because they're doing human things. They're cool because they're like, hey, fuck you, no boats here, right? Like whatever. But like, so there is also, I don't know, I guess I want to say that there is this other kind of fascination. I was wondering if you could theorize it a little bit, this fascination of not letting animals be, but animals insisting on their animality in a way that is not this sort of like prosaic pastoral image, right? My favorite, when I lived in Chicago, there was this moral panic because all of these eagles and hawks had moved into the city. And because they love rats, and cities are great at making lots of rats. But the problem was they also attacked people with big hair. Right, so they would like grab people who had particularly dramatic hair, and they were like, "Oh my God, the eagles are going to kill people." And of course, no one ever got killed by an eagle. It's really disappointing. But like, so is there something like, how do we think about this sort of like insurgent nature in some sense, right? This sort of nature that is like, of course we can live in a city, right? Like, of course we can live, you know, coyotes are actually one of my other favorite examples, right? Like they're just like all over Dallas, Texas now. And they are totally cool with navigating freeways and houses and trash cans and, you know, let's not bring up the trash can and the possums, two of my favorite animals. But like, so like, what is that a kind of different leverage, right? Like where instead of seeing like the animal yoked to the sleigh, but like the animal that's like, thank you for putting the food I want in this lovely shiny silver can, and I would like to give you a lot of work in the morning when you have to clean it up. Like, is that like another kind of point, and would you want to theorize that differently?
No, totally. And like, and I certainly didn't mean to say that the internet only clicks on a certain kind of way. Like, I think there are a few different ways, like, so like, but
yeah, go.
But I think like animals sort of hard trolling humans is also very popular, and that's part of why, and sort of and trolling human spaces sort of is also popular and hilarious and positive in a certain way. And I mean, if you read about so the Naruto monkey that I've been exploiting for years, who took all these photos, one of the he stole the camera from the photographer that ended up suing him. And if you read anything about the case, the photographer just looks like a total bonehead, right? He just leaves his camera out, he goes away, he comes back, gets mad about all the photos. I mean, it's just like, so I think that it's a really good question, Sedequet, because like differentiating sort of which relations to animals are entertaining and why, and which seem to have a future promise and which don't, I think is a really important question. So the question of like animals, as we saw during COVID, when, you know, everything got shut down, animals were happy for all the free real estate and happy to take it up. And every city got, you know, or a lot of cities got a kind of overrun, quote unquote, return to nature sort of situation. I think those examples like show people are very entertained and also sympathetic to animals retooling spaces. I think part of what my legal and political work has been is like that sort of feeling and that sort of fellow feeling one has with those animals has not translated into different legal or political norms at the level of the city or at the level of constructing human political communities that give any weight or any consideration, any positivity to animals habitating in human areas or retooling human areas or re-engaging with them, right? Like, I think there is a general sense of like, hey, that's cool. They trolled those humans, great. But you know, I'd like it to be more than a feeling. That's sort of how I think about the right to singularity and those sorts of things.
I have one more question.
Thank you so much. In talking about that right to singularity, I was wondering if you have thoughts on like the neural link of these brain computer interfaces that are being done with animals. Is that an extension of this idea of singularity? And what does it look like when animals can start to access the internet or be able to communicate with us?
I think it's a great question. I think it's something that I am actively reading about and want to know more about. I think there has to be at least two reactions to it, or at least there should be. The first should be a sort of don't get too scared about animals integrating into technology, even though the people who are doing it are, to me, scary. So there's a sense of like, I don't trust Elon Musk to do anything with monkey brains. I want us to keep the monkey brains away from him. But I do think the question of should monkeys be able at some point to browse the internet? I don't see why not. I don't see if they want to do it, if they want to engage with it. I mean, they'll probably beat me at League of Legends too. I mean, I just like I don't know. We have to think of other relations and new novel relations with animals, in part mediated by technology, because the relation that we've sort of grown up with intellectually, I don't mean literally, but I mean just in terms of human history, the relation we've had with animals for a very long time is now totally untenable and is just going to result in them being obliterated. So we have to think of other ways. If part of that is them being able to search for monkey stuff, which I really don't want to think about what a monkey would search for if they. I think it could be great. Hey, they should be able to do it. They should be able to do it. Okay. Let he who has cast the first stone in all of this. But I just think so. It's a productive, creative vector. But what I will say is the reason that we have people like Elon Musk doing it is because I think people on the ecological left have been very, very gun shy about thinking any other or any technological relation, any animal machine relation to animals. And I think we've got to get over that. I mean, it's my hope. Yeah.
All right. Well, then on that note, please join me.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Very late there. Thanks for coming all the way from the East Coast. Sure.
No problem.
All right. Take snacks. Please take food home with you. We have nowhere to put it. I don't want to walk home with food in my pockets. Thank you.